A world of white and silence. Snow blankets the Moldavian highlands in an unbroken sheet, smoothing every ridge, burying every path, erasing the familiar contours of the land beneath a pristine, merciless shroud. The ancient Carpathian forests stand frozen beneath it, their blackened trunks rising like the ribs of something long dead. Deep gorges lie choked with ice. The Barlad River winds sluggishly through the valley floor, its surface glazed and treacherous, its slow current murmuring beneath a skin of brittle frost. The cold is absolute, it claws at exposed skin, burns the lungs with every breath, and turns the air itself into something sharp and crystalline. Mist rises from the icebound streams and low marshes, thick and ghost-like, coiling upward and spreading across the valley as if the land is exhaling its last breath before dawn. It clings to the ground, swallowing distance, blurring edges, smothering sound. This is not peaceful. It is a silence taut with anticipation. Before the deep dive, where in the world are you watching from today? Subscribe and journey with us through the battles, the legends, and the moments that change the course of history forever. Let the story draw you in. High above the valley floor, on a narrow ridge half hidden by a skeletal grove of birch trees, a solitary figure stands motionless. He has been there for hours. Snow has settled along the folds of his fur-lined cloak, crusting the edges with ice. Frost clings to his beard. His breath escapes in slow, measured plumes that vanish almost as soon as they form. This is Stephen III of Moldavia. He does not shift his weight. He does not speak. His dark eyes remain fixed on the mouth of the valley below, where the land narrows into a natural funnel of forest, swamp, and frozen riverbank. It is a place where movement is forced into lines, where choices disappear, where an army must go forward because there is nowhere else to go. Stephen's expression is unreadable. There is no fire in his gaze, no visible fury, only concentration, calculation, the look of a man who has already walked this moment forward in his mind, step by step, consequence by consequence. He is not alone. Behind him, woven seamlessly into the frozen landscape, are the people of Moldavia. Peasant archers crouch behind snow-drifted logs and earthen berms, their rough hands wrapped around self-made bows. These are men who have spent their lives cutting timber, breaking soil, hauling stone, hands knotted by labour, now steady with purpose. Their arrows are fletched with care, their quivers tucked close to their bodies for warmth. Boyars sit astride sturdy, shaggy horses bred for endurance, not elegance. Their mounts stamp the frozen ground softly, nostrils flaring, breaths steaming into the grey air. The men wear steel cuirasses dulled by frost and age, armour that has seen other wars, other winters. Their faces are set, solemn, stripped of illusion. These are not knights expecting glory. These are landholders defending the ground beneath their feet. Farmers turned foot soldiers stand shoulder to shoulder along the ridgelines, gripping spears, axes, and polearms. Many wear no armour at all, only thick wool and leather stiffened by cold. Their faces are pale, drawn tight by fear and resolve in equal measure. Some whisper prayers under their breath. Others stare silently into the fog, waiting. They number perhaps 20,000. It is not an army assembled by wealth or ambition. It is an army assembled by necessity. And somewhere beyond the southern pass, beyond the veil of mist and frozen forest, something vast is moving. At first, it is not seen. It is felt. A low vibration passes through the ground, subtle but unmistakable, like distant thunder trapped beneath the earth. Then sound follows, metal striking metal, the creak of wagons, the rhythmic churn of tens of thousands of boots pressing into frozen soil. The noise grows, layered and immense, filling the valley long before the first shapes emerge from the fog. The Ottoman war machine is advancing, 40,000 strong. Janissaries march in ordered columns, their discipline forged through years of drilling and conquest. Their white Burke hats glow faintly in the gloom, ghostly shapes moving in precise rhythm. Sipahi cavalry ride alongside them on sleek, restless horses, armour gleaming dully beneath layers of frost. Heavy cannon are dragged forward with effort, iron wheels groaning over ice and hardened mud, pulled by teams of men and beasts straining against the cold. It is the sound of empire, a serpent of steel and confidence, vast and practised, moving with the expectation of victory. This is not an army marching to test itself. It is an army marching to crush resistance, to end a problem, to remind a smaller land of its place in the world. They believe they are pursuing a broken foe. They believe Moldavia is already retreating, already unravelling under the weight of inevitability. They believe this frozen valley is nothing more than a corridor, another obstacle to be crossed on the road to submission. They are wrong. Stephen watches as the Ottoman vanguard emerges into the valley floor, shapes resolving slowly through the fog. Then the main body follows. The narrow terrain compresses their formations, forcing the mass of men and horses into tighter columns, shoulder to shoulder, rank pressing against rank. The valley fills with movement, with steel, with breath and noise. Stephen does not see an invincible army. He sees geometry, he sees angles and distances, choke points and blind spots. Every winding trail that led them here, every frozen ford they crossed, every ridge they struggled up through snow and ice, it was no accident. It was design, a sequence of choices made weeks ago, months ago, with this moment always in mind. This valley is not terrain, it is a weapon, the mist, the ice, the narrow ground beneath their feet. All of it has been shaped, patiently, deliberately, into something lethal. Stephen raises his gauntleted hand. The motion is small, almost gentle, but it ripples backward through the Moldavian ranks like a held breath finally taken. Absolute stillness follows. Horses stop shifting, men freeze where they crouch, fingers tighten on bowstrings, hands settle more firmly around spear shafts and reins. Below, the Ottoman host continues forward, unaware that thousands of eyes are fixed upon them from every unseen ridge. Stephen's hand cuts down. A single Moldavian Busium war horn bellows. The sound is deep and mournful, raw and ancient, as if torn directly from the earth itself. It rolls through the valley, slamming into the rock walls, echoing back on itself until direction becomes meaningless. The silence does not break, it shatters. From the concealed ridges, a black cloud of arrows rises. They arc upward in near unison, vanishing briefly into the fog before descending with a deadly whisper. A second volley follows before the first has fully struck. Then a third. Men fall. At first there is confusion, silent collapses, bodies dropping without sound as arrows find throats, faces, gaps in armour. Then the shouting begins, cries of pain. Orders barked into the fog, shields raised too late against a sky they cannot see. Before command can solidify, the valley erupts. Moldavian falconets and hackbutts, hidden on sledges along the tree line, roar to life. Fire and iron tear into the compressed columns. The concussions are monstrous in the confined space, amplified by the rock walls and thick air. Cannonballs rip through packed ranks, smashing bodies, shattering cohesion, turning disciplined formations into writhing chaos. Smoke pours into the fog, thickening it, weaponizing it. Visibility collapses, sound distorts. The Ottomans are suddenly fighting an enemy they cannot locate, in a landscape that seems to attack from every direction at once. Stephen watches. He does not shout. He does not cheer. He stands like a figure carved from the winter itself, eyes fixed on the unfolding storm below. This is not chaos to him. This is the execution of a plan forged through patience, sacrifice, and the quiet knowledge that there would be no second chance. This is not merely a battle. It is the springing of a trap built by an entire nation. A small people, armed with nothing but their understanding of their own land and a desperate will to exist, have turned the earth itself against an empire. And when the mist finally begins to thin beneath the pale winter sun, what will be revealed on the ice will shake courts and cathedrals across Europe. For on this frozen morning, at the edge of a forgotten valley, a superpower is about to be shattered, and a modest nation is about to guard the gate to a continent. The 15th century did not feel like an age of progress to those living in its shadow. It felt like an age of narrowing horizons. Borders shifted constantly, not through negotiation, but through collapse. Kingdoms that had stood for centuries vanished within a generation, absorbed into larger powers or torn apart by internal fracture. For rulers across Europe, the future did not promise stability, it promised pressure. Nowhere was that pressure more constant, more terrifying than in the southeast. There, Rising from Anatolia and the ruins of older empires stood the Ottoman Empire, a state unlike anything Europe had faced before. It did not merely conquer territory, it reorganized it. It absorbed lands, peoples, and systems into a single disciplined structure capable of sustaining near-constant war. Its armies were not temporary levies assembled for a single campaign. They were permanent instruments of expansion, supported by taxation, logistics, and administration on a scale few European states could match. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had sent a shockwave through the Christian world. It was not just the loss of a city, it was the collapse of a symbol, the final proof that ancient walls, venerable traditions, and desperate prayers were no longer enough. After that moment, the Ottomans no longer appeared as a distant Eastern power. They appeared as an advancing certainty. Year by year, the map changed. Serbia fell, Bosnia followed. Fortresses that had once been considered unassailable surrendered or were ground down by artillery. Armies that rode out, confident in their faith and lineage, returned shattered, if they returned at all. Some rulers resisted and were destroyed, others submitted, hoping that tribute and obedience might buy time. But time, under an expanding empire, rarely led to safety. In the midst of this shifting world lay Moldavia. It was not a grand kingdom. It did not command vast wealth or ancient prestige. Its strength lay elsewhere, in its geography and in its position. Moldavia occupied a hinge point between worlds. To the south lay Ottoman-controlled lands, and the Black Sea. To the west and north stood Hungary and Poland-Lithuania. Whoever held Moldavia controlled access to the Danube estuaries, the Black Sea ports, and the mountain passes leading deep into Central Europe. Moldavia was not the prize, it was the gate, and gates are rarely left in the hands of those too weak to defend them. This reality defined Moldavian politics long before Stephen III took the throne. The principality existed in a constant state of negotiation, balancing tribute and autonomy, resistance and survival. Its rulers learned to read the moods of their larger neighbours carefully, because a misstep could mean annihilation. Stephen inherited this fragile position in 1457. He did not ascend to power amid celebration or stability. He took control of a land already accustomed to danger, a land that understood how quickly independence could be erased. From the beginning of his rule, Stephen demonstrated an unusual clarity. He did not mistake pride for strength nor defiance for wisdom. He understood that Moldavia could not challenge its neighbours openly, not yet. So he ruled cautiously, he paid tribute when necessary. He negotiated relentlessly. He manoeuvred diplomatically between Hungary and Poland, seeking recognition without submission. To the Ottomans, he presented himself as a compliant vassal, but never a conquered one. It was a delicate performance, one that required constant adjustment. For a time it worked. Moldavia remained independent, while other states disappeared. Stephen fortified key positions, strengthened internal authority, and cultivated loyalty among both the boyars and the peasantry. He ruled firmly, but not arbitrarily. He understood that in a land without deep resources, unity was the most valuable currency, but even the most careful balance has limits. As the Ottoman Empire expanded, its expectations grew, tribute payments increased, diplomatic language hardened, requests became demands. Moldavia's control over its Black Sea ports, particularly Chilia and Cetatea Alba, became a point of contention. These ports were not merely economic assets, they were strategic footholds, and the Ottomans wanted them. Stephen resisted, not recklessly, not openly at first, but firmly. He defended Moldavian rights as they had existed for generations. He delayed, he argued, he reinforced garrisons. Each act was small in isolation, but together they signalled something dangerous to Constantinople: defiance. From the Ottoman perspective, this was not a disagreement between equals. It was a challenge to imperial authority. Empires survive not just by conquering land, but by ensuring that resistance does not become contagious. A small state that successfully defied demands could inspire others to try the same. That could not be allowed. By the early 1470s, the relationship between Moldavia and the Ottoman Empire had become brittle. Skirmishes flared along the Danube frontier. Turkish raiding parties clashed with Moldavian defenders. Disputes over fortresses escalated into armed confrontations. The veneer of diplomacy cracked. Stephen understood what this meant. He had seen the pattern before. When the Ottomans decided a vassal had become unreliable, the response was never subtle. They did not negotiate from weakness. They assembled overwhelming force and removed the problem entirely. By late 1474, intelligence reaching Suceava confirmed Stephen's fears. In Constantinople, the issue of Moldavia had been discussed at the highest levels. The conclusion was clear: Moldavia would not be managed. It would be conquered. An order went out. An army would be assembled under Hadim Suleiman Pasha, an experienced commander trusted with difficult operations. This was not a punitive raid designed to remind a vassal of its obligations. It was a full-scale invasion intended to crush Moldavian resistance in a single, decisive blow. For Stephen, this marked the end of ambiguity. There would be no compromise now, no tribute sufficient to halt the march, no letter persuasive enough to stop an army already in motion. Moldavia faced the same choice so many others had faced before it: submit and be absorbed, or resist and risk annihilation. Stephen chose resistance, not because he believed victory was assured, but because he understood that surrender would lead only to gradual erasure. Moldavia's laws, its leaders, its autonomy would disappear piece by piece. Survival required something more dangerous than compliance. It required confrontation, on terms Moldavia could control. Stephen knew he could not defeat the Ottomans by meeting them in open battle on favourable ground. That would be suicide. He could not rely on Europe for timely assistance. He had already appealed to Hungary and Poland before, and their responses had been cautious, delayed, and insufficient. If Moldavia was to survive, it would do so alone. And so, as winter tightened, its grip on the land and reports confirmed that Ottoman forces were assembling south of the Danube, Stephen began planning not just a defence, but a reckoning. He would not wait behind walls to be starved or battered into submission. He would draw the empire into a place of his choosing, somewhere cold, somewhere narrow, somewhere where numbers would become a burden instead of an advantage. That place lay near a modest settlement called Vaslui. And the choices Stephen made next, choices rooted in geography, psychology, and sacrifice, would determine whether Moldavia would vanish like so many other names on the map, or endure long enough to force history itself to pause. Understood. Winter settled over Moldavia not as a season, but as a condition. The cold came early and stayed late, seeping into stone walls, into timber beams, into the marrow of men and animals alike. Rivers slowed, then froze. Forest paths vanished beneath snowdrifts. The land grew quiet, but it was not the quiet of rest. It was the quiet of waiting. Stephen understood winter better than most rulers ever would. Where others saw paralysis, he saw opportunity. Most armies avoided large-scale operations in deep winter. Supply lines broke down, horses weakened, men sickened. But Stephen knew something else as well. Winter erased margins for error. An army unfamiliar with the land could bleed itself dry without ever meeting an enemy. He intended to make sure the Ottomans never found their footing. His preparations began far from the battlefield, in villages that would never appear in chronicles. Orders were sent quietly, carried by trusted riders who knew when to speak and when to remain silent. Communities along the southeastern approaches were told to move inland, deeper into the forests and hills. Not in panic, not all at once, but steadily, deliberately. Homes were abandoned with care, food stores were hidden or destroyed, grain was buried, livestock driven north, tools removed. Nothing that could sustain a marching army was left behind. It was a scorched earth policy, but not a reckless one. Stephen did not burn Moldavia out of desperation. He stripped it bare with precision. For the peasants, this was sacrifice made real. These were not abstract strategies discussed in warm chambers. These were families leaving behind fields they had tended for generations, barns they had built with their own hands. They did it without revolt, without complaint, because they understood what was at stake. If the land fed the invader, Moldavia would not survive. Wells along known routes were sealed, bridges weakened or dismantled, forest trails were subtly altered, narrowed, or blocked by trees, felled just enough to look like natural winter damage. Frozen river crossings were studied obsessively. Stephen's scouts walked them repeatedly, memorizing where ice held firm and where currents thinned it beneath the surface. Winter, to Stephen, was a map waiting to be read. At the same time, he reshaped his army. He did not attempt to mimic Ottoman organization. That would have been futile. Instead, he refined what Moldavia already did best: mobility, familiarity, adaptation. Light cavalry became his eyes and his teeth. These horsemen were not meant to stand and trade blows. They were meant to appear suddenly, strike fast, and disappear into forest and fog. They learned to ride silently over snow, to use terrain as cover, to attack from directions that made no sense to an outsider. Archers trained relentlessly, not for volleys in open fields, but for shooting from elevation, from concealment, from awkward angles that punished tight formations. Every ridge, every tree line, every slope became a potential firing position. Even the peasant levies were not wasted as expendable mass. Stephen understood their greatest strength was knowledge. They knew which paths flooded first in winter, which swamps froze solid and which remained treacherous, which valleys trapped sound and which carried it for miles. That knowledge was weaponized. The boyars and their retinues formed the core of Stephen's striking force. These were his anchor, disciplined, armoured, capable of delivering decisive force when the moment came. Stephen kept them close, drilling them not for prolonged combat, but for timing. They would not be unleashed early. They would strike when confusion had already done half the work. By the time the preparations were complete, Stephen had gathered perhaps 20,000 men. He knew the number well. He knew how small it was compared to what was coming. He did not lie to his soldiers about this. He did not promise victory or divine protection. He spoke instead of survival, of endurance, of the land that had shaped them and would now fight alongside them. He told them plainly, Moldavia could not afford a single mistake. In a final effort, Stephen reached beyond his borders. He sent appeals north and west, to Poland, to Hungary. His messages were measured, not desperate. He did not beg, he warned. If Moldavia fell, he argued, the road into their realms would lie open. The replies returned slowly. They were courteous, sympathetic, empty. Hungary offered words. Poland offered concern. Neither offered armies. Stephen accepted this with the clarity of a man who had already anticipated the answer. Hope was not a strategy. Moldavia would stand alone. As December deepened, reports from the south grew more frequent. Ottoman camps were forming. Supply depots were filling. The logistical machinery of empire was turning its attention northward. Stephen responded not with defiance, but with disappearance. Moldavian forces withdrew from obvious positions. Camps were hidden deeper in forests. Patrols avoided direct confrontation. From the Ottoman perspective, Moldavia appeared to be doing exactly what smaller states always did when faced with overwhelming force. It retreated, but this retreat was a performance. Behind the illusion of collapse, Stephen began shaping the killing ground. His focus narrowed to a valley system near Vaslui, a place of converging terrain, where the Barlad River wound through marshy ground flanked by rising ridges and wooded slopes. Stephen walked it himself. He observed how fog settled there at dawn, thick and persistent. He listened to how sound echoed and distorted between the slopes. He studied how snow concealed pits and softened edges. This was a place where a large army would be forced into compression, where its advantages would suffocate it. Shallow pits were dug and camouflaged beneath fresh snow, not deep enough to be obvious, but deep enough to break formations, to injure horses, to introduce hesitation at critical moments. Archers were assigned positions behind ridgelines that offered clear lines of fire while remaining invisible from below. Small artillery pieces, falconets and hackbutts were mounted on sledges so they could be repositioned. Silently, they were hidden among trees, angled not for long-range bombardment, but for devastating enfilade fire into packed formations. Meanwhile, Moldavian cavalry began harassing the advancing Ottomans, not enough to provoke caution, but enough to reinforce overconfidence. Supply trains were struck, scouts disappeared, then the attackers vanished, leaving behind just enough chaos to suggest disorganization rather than intent. It was a delicate balance. Too much resistance would alert the Ottomans. Too little would make them suspicious. Stephen maintained the illusion perfectly. By early January, the Ottoman army had crossed into Moldavia. Tens of thousands of men advanced into a land that no longer offered food, warmth, or certainty. Cold mist thickened with each mile. Streams froze unpredictably. trails narrowed, the sense of pursuit remained, but so did the sense that something was wrong. Still, the Ottomans pressed forward. They believed Moldavia was nearly finished. Stephen knew better. From his concealed positions, his scouts tracked every movement. He waited as the Ottoman host followed the very routes he had prepared, drawing them deeper into the interior, closer to the valley he had chosen. Vaslui drew nearer. The land was ready, the men were ready, and the empire, confident and committed, was walking directly into the trap. Before dawn on January the 10th, 1475, the valley near Vaslui ceased to feel like a place at all. It became an enclosure. A dense, frozen fog rolled in during the final hours of darkness, heavier than on previous mornings, settling low and thick across the ground. It crept into the reeds along the riverbanks, climbed the lower slopes, and pulled in every depression. The ridges vanished. Distances collapsed. Sound dulled and bent in unnatural ways. The world shrank to a few paces in every direction. Stephen had prayed for this. He knew the Ottomans relied on clarity, on visibility, on command signals, on formations, that moved as a single body. Fog did not merely obscure vision, it severed coordination. It turned discipline into guesswork. High above the valley floor, Moldavian soldiers waited. They had been in position since before midnight, motionless in the cold, muscles aching, breath carefully controlled. Snow settled on shoulders and helms. Fingers numbed around bowstrings and spear shafts. No one spoke. Orders had already been given. Every man knew his role, his timing, his silence. Down below, the first sounds of the Ottoman advance began to seep into the fog. At first, it was a low murmur, boots crunching on frozen ground, the clink of harnesses, the creak of wagons. Then it grew, layer by layer, until the valley itself seemed to hum with movement. Tens of thousands of men were forcing their way forward through a narrow corridor, compressed by terrain they could barely perceive. They believed they were closing in on a fleeing enemy. They believed the Moldavian army was somewhere ahead, retreating once again into the cold interior. They did not know they were already surrounded. The Ottoman vanguard entered the valley cautiously, but not fearfully. Scouts probed ahead, but the fog revealed nothing. The ground appeared solid. No resistance showed itself. Encouraged, the main body followed, filling the valley floor with steel, leather, and breath. Columns tightened. Units pressed closer together to maintain cohesion in the mist. This instinct, so valuable on open ground, now worked against them. The army's mass became a liability, a single, enormous shape moving blindly forward. Above them, unseen, Moldavian archers adjusted their footing. Stephen watched from his concealed position on the ridge. He could hear the Ottomans now, close enough to distinguish individual sounds within the greater noise. He waited until the bulk of the army was fully committed, until retreat would mean collision, confusion, collapse. Then he gave the signal. A war horn sounded, not loud at first, one deep note rolling through the fog like distant thunder. Then another answered it, and another, from different directions. The sound echoed off the valley walls, overlapping, bending, losing any sense of origin. To the Ottomans, it felt as if the land itself was calling out. They slowed, some units halted. Officers shouted orders, but the fog swallowed words before they could travel. Men strained their eyes into the pale grey void, searching for shapes that refused to form. And then the sky fell. Arrows erupted from the heights in disciplined waves. Hundreds, then thousands, descending silently until impact. Shields came up too late, helmets rang, men staggered and fell, tripping those behind them. Horses screamed as arrows buried themselves in flesh. The Ottomans tried to respond, but to what? The fog hid the ridges. The arrows came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Before order could be restored, the valley thundered. Moldavian artillery fired. Falconets and hackbutts roared from concealed positions along the slopes, their blast magnified by the narrow gorge. Cannonballs tore through the compressed ranks, smashing bodies, ripping gaps in formations that could not be closed. The shockwaves echoed back and forth, overlapping, disorienting. Smoke poured into the fog, thickening it further. Visibility collapsed entirely. The Ottomans raised shields, crouched, shouted, tried to regroup, but commands contradicted one another. Units advanced when they should have held. Others attempted to pull back, only to crash into men still pushing forward. Stephen was dismantling them piece by piece. Then came the next phase. From the fog, Moldavian cavalry struck. Small, fast groups burst out from unexpected angles, loosing arrows at close range, slashing with blades, then vanishing back into the mist before Ottoman cavalry could respond. Some attacks came from the left, others from the right, some directly behind units that believed their rear secure. The Ottomans began fighting phantoms. Every attempt to form a stable line was disrupted by another sudden strike. Every effort to advance triggered a fresh volley from above. Panic crept through the ranks, subtle at first, then spreading as men realized they could not see the enemy, could not hear clear orders, could not even tell where safety lay. The fog turned fear contagious. Stephen waited. He watched the empire unravel, not through brute force, but through loss of control. Only when the Ottomans were fully disoriented, when cohesion had collapsed into isolated pockets of resistance, did he signal the final blow. The Busium horns sounded again. This time, the call was unmistakable. From the ridges and tree lines, Moldavia's main body surged forward. Infantry poured down the slopes, shields locked, weapons raised. The boyars and their armoured retinues followed, charging into the valley with devastating momentum. It was like an avalanche. The Ottomans, already struggling to stand firm on icy ground, were hit head-on by a force they could finally see, but far too late. Moldavian infantry slammed into them from the front, while cavalry hammered their flanks. Arrows continued to rain from above, pinning units in place. The valley dissolved into chaos. Horses slipped and fell. Men screamed as footing vanished beneath them. Shields shattered, blades rang. Commands became meaningless noise. The Ottoman army, once a model of discipline, now existed only as fragments. Isolated groups fighting desperately, blindly. Some tried to flee. They ran toward the frozen Barlad River, seeking escape across what they believed to be solid ground. But the ice had been weakened deliberately, its strength studied and undermined. Under the weight of panicked men and horses, it gave way. Ice cracked. Men plunged into freezing water, armour dragging them down. Those who reached the far bank found Moldavian forces waiting, units that had looped behind the valley during the confusion, sealing every exit. There was no way out. Stephen entered the battlefield only when resistance had collapsed into survival. His presence spread through the Moldavian ranks like fire. Men pressed harder, drove deeper, fought with renewed fury. By mid-morning, the fog began to thin. As the pale winter sun filtered through, it revealed a valley transformed. Bodies lay scattered across the snow. Broken banners trailed in the slush. Weapons littered the ground where disciplined ranks had once stood. The Ottoman army was broken. Those who survived fled south in scattered bands, hunted relentlessly by Moldavian trackers who knew every path, every ravine, every frozen stream. What had marched north as a conquering force now dissolved into a desperate retreat. By noon, the battle was over. The silence that followed was heavier than the one that had preceded it. Wind swept across the valley, stirring snow and smoke, carrying with it the knowledge that something extraordinary had happened. A small principality had not merely survived an imperial assault, it had shattered it. For the Ottomans, the defeat was unthinkable. For Moldavia, it was salvation forged in ice, fog, and unwavering resolve. And far beyond Vaslui, though they did not yet know it, Europe had been given time. When the last echoes of combat finally faded, the valley did not immediately feel victorious. It felt stunned. For several long moments, no one spoke. Men who had been shouting orders only minutes before now stood motionless, their breath fogging the cold air, as if they were afraid that sound itself might awaken something left unfinished. Weapons hung loosely in hands that trembled, not from fear anymore, but from the delayed arrival of exhaustion. Some soldiers sank to their knees without realizing they had done so, the weight of the morning finally pressing down on bodies that had been driven by instinct alone. Victory does not arrive with clarity, it arrives with confusion. The human mind, having spent hours narrowing its focus to survival, struggles to widen again. Faces that had been enemies moments ago now appeared simply human, still, silent, unthreatening. The valley held its breath as Moldavian soldiers slowly came to understand that the danger had passed, that the sound of hooves and steel would not return with the fog. Not yet. The fog, which had concealed so much death, began to thin and drift away as the morning wore on. Pale sunlight filtered through the remaining haze, illuminating a landscape utterly transformed. Where hours earlier an imperial army had advanced in confident order, now there lay only fragments, broken formations frozen in place, abandoned weapons half buried in churned snow, bodies scattered across ice and mud. It did not look like the aftermath of a battle between two armies. There was no clean line dividing victor from defeated. Instead, the ground itself seemed complicit, mud and ice swallowing shields, snow darkened where men had fallen and not risen again. In places, footprints overlapped so densely they erased direction altogether, a record of panic rather than strategy. Broken bows lay beside snapped spear shafts. Drums, once used to keep time and order, were crushed under boots that no longer marched. Some Moldavian soldiers searched instinctively for familiar faces among the chaos. A helmet half buried in slush, a cloak torn away and frozen stiff. Relief came in sharp, fleeting bursts when a man was found alive, followed immediately by dread when another could not be found at all. The valley offered no explanations, only evidence. It looked like the aftermath of a calamity. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay where they had fallen, some struck down by arrows, others crushed beneath cannon fire, many lost near the river where ice and water had claimed them together. War banners that once proclaimed imperial authority now trailed limply across the ground, their colours dulled by frost and blood. Horses wandered riderless through the wreckage, steam rising from their flanks in the cold air. Stephen did not ride forward in triumph. He understood something that many commanders never did. The moment after victory is the most dangerous moment of all. Men flushed with survival and success are quick to forget discipline. They chase shadows, they overreach, they mistake the enemy's collapse for their own invincibility. Stephen had seen enough war to know that restraint now mattered more than courage had hours earlier. His presence was calm, almost austere. There was no raised voice, no dramatic gesture. Orders were given evenly, as though the battle were still unfolding and demanded respect. His restraint set the tone. The army followed his pace not because they were commanded to, but because they trusted him. This trust had been earned long before Vaslui. He entered the valley slowly, deliberately, his horse picking its way through the disturbed snow and debris. His captains gathered around him, reporting in quiet voices what units had been destroyed, which enemy formations had fled, where resistance might still linger. Stephen listened carefully. Victory on the battlefield was never the end of danger. A shattered army could still regroup if given time. He ordered restraint. Moldavian forces pursued the retreating Ottomans only as far as prudence allowed. Small, fast units tracked fleeing bands through the forests and ravines, harrying them, preventing reorganization, ensuring the rout remained a rout. But Stephen refused to allow his men to be drawn too far south, into unfamiliar ground, where exhaustion and overconfidence could undo everything they had achieved. Discipline had won the day. Discipline also softened the cost. The wounded were gathered first, before prisoners were counted or trophies claimed. Cloaks were torn into bandages. Water was shared sparingly. Men who had fought beside one another hours earlier now supported each other's weight, moving slowly through the snow that no longer concealed danger, only pain. There were no cheers, only quiet acknowledgements, hands clasped briefly, heads bowed, eyes averted from what could not be changed. Victory had spared them annihilation, but it had not spared them loss. Every formation carried gaps that would never be filled again. Every village would feel the absence of sons who did not return. In the quiet that followed, the soldiers became aware of another kind of weight, the weight of survival itself. Men who had been propelled by adrenaline and fear hours earlier now faced the stillness, and it was almost unbearable. Some crouched beside fallen comrades, eyes tracing the outlines of familiar helmets, trying to memorize them, to commit them to memory before the snow claimed them completely. Others wandered slowly, glancing at the horizon as though the next ridge might hide another wave of enemy, yet finding only the empty traces of a shattered force. The air was so still that every exhale seemed loud, almost intrusive, like a reminder that they were still alive and that others were not. The valley itself seemed to hold its breath. Trees that had been silent spectators now appeared like sentinels, their branches bowed with snow and witness. The wind whispered across frozen ridges, carrying the faintest groans from men and horses alike, and the sound of ice cracking beneath the hidden weight. Victory was not a cheer. It was the slow, careful acknowledgement that survival had come at a cost beyond counting. Stephen allowed this silence. He did not try to replace it with ceremony. He moved among his soldiers quietly, stopping occasionally to offer a word or nod. Not for glory, not for praise, but to ensure that each man understood that the fight was not yet over, that their vigilance must persist even in moments when their hearts ached for rest. The most battered foot soldiers looked to him, expecting instructions or consolation, and received instead a calm presence, a presence that reminded them that courage and restraint were intertwined. Stephen's eyes lingered on those who bore visible wounds, on those limping across the ice-strewn field, their boots caked with mud and blood. He did not speak of reward or honour, he simply made his rounds, confirming that the army still breathed as one, and that the fragile thread of discipline remained unbroken. This was leadership at its most profound, not commanding triumph, but safeguarding it, moment by moment, long after the clash of arms had ended. It would not be abandoned afterward. Reports returned quickly, and they told a consistent story. The Ottoman army was no longer an army. It had dissolved into scattered remnants, fleeing in different directions, many without weapons, supplies, or leadership. Cold and hunger claimed those who escaped the valley. Others were captured. Many never reached safety at Iod. All. By nightfall, there was no question left. The invasion had failed. News spread through Moldavia cautiously at first, carried by riders and whispered from village to village. People emerged slowly from forests and hiding places, unsure whether to trust what they were hearing. Then they saw Moldavian soldiers returning, exhausted, wounded, but unmistakably victorious, leading prisoners, carrying captured standards. Relief swept through the land. It was not the relief of celebration, but of survival. Families returned to homes they had feared lost forever. Fires were lit again in hearths that had gone cold. The land, stripped bare to starve an invader, began the long process of reclaiming itself. That night, Stephen convened his advisers. There was no feast, no triumphal display. The men who gathered around him bore the marks of the day, blood-stained cloaks, bandaged wounds, faces drawn tight by exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue lay something deeper. Pride. They had done what logic said could not be done. They had faced an empire and endured. Stephen listened to reports late into the night, but his thoughts were already turning outward. He knew this victory would not remain secret for long, and he knew it had to be understood correctly. This was not merely a Moldavian success, it was a warning. Riders were dispatched in all directions, carrying word of what had happened at Vaslui to the courts of Europe, to Hungary, to Poland, to the Holy Roman lands and beyond. Stephen's messages were precise. He did not exaggerate, he did not boast, he stated facts and consequences. If Moldavia had fallen, the road north would now lie open. Across Europe, the reaction was immediate and profound. The news did not arrive all at once. It travelled the way all dangerous truth do, slowly at first, carried by riders who were not yet believed. In border towns, rumours were dismissed as exaggeration. In courts accustomed to hearing only of Ottoman advance, the idea of a decisive defeat felt improbable, even suspicious. Then the stories aligned, different messengers, different routes, the same outcome. An imperial army halted. A winter valley turned against it. A ruler long underestimated refusing to disappear. Shock gave way to something rarer. Hope. Hope, fragile as it was, spread unevenly. In distant villages, people who had lived under the shadow of Ottoman raids for decades finally allowed themselves to imagine a winter without the constant threat of destruction. They began to rebuild fences, to feed animals they had left behind, to venture cautiously beyond their doors. Children, previously hidden in attics or barns, peeked out at the sun-dappled snow, sensing that life might continue without immediate fear. Yet this hope was tempered by memory. Everyone understood that the empire was not defeated in perpetuity. It was simply delayed. Stephen's victory had bought time, a priceless commodity, but it was not a permanent reprieve. Those who celebrated did so with respect for the lives already lost, and with knowledge that vigilance would be the price of any future peace. In this tension between relief and fear, the Moldavian spirit was forged more sharply than ever, strengthened by what they had survived and what they would now guard. For the first time in years, Europe was not reacting to Ottoman movement, it was reacting to Ottoman failure. And in that pause, in that moment of recalculation, Moldavia's stand gained a meaning far beyond its borders. Rulers who had previously offered only polite sympathy now spoke openly of astonishment. Chroniclers recorded the defeat with disbelief. In Krakow, church bells rang for days. In Rome, the Pope proclaimed Stephen an athlete of Christ, a defender of the faith standing against overwhelming force. In marketplaces and taverns, travellers retold the story with growing awe. A small land, a winter valley, an empire stopped cold. But Stephen did not allow the praise to distract him. He understood the nature of the enemy he had wounded. The Ottoman Empire was vast, resilient, and unforgiving of humiliation. It would regroup, it would return. Vaslui had not ended the threat, it had delayed it. And delay, Stephen knew, was its own kind of victory. In the weeks that followed, Moldavia did not rest. Fortifications were reinforced, roads were repaired, supplies were gathered, the army was reorganised, wounded men cared for, survivors integrated back into defensive plans. Stephen walked the valley of Vaslui one last time, before winter loosened its grip. Snow still covered the ground, but it no longer felt silent in the same way. The land bore memory now. Every ridge, every bend of the river, every stand of trees had been part of something larger than itself. As night fell, Moldavian soldiers lit fires along the heights where they had once waited in silence. Flames flickered against the snow, casting long shadows across the frozen earth. Some men prayed, others sat quietly, thinking of those who had fallen. A few simply stared upward at the cold stars, trying to understand how they had lived through a moment that history would remember long after their names were forgotten. Stephen looked out over the valley in silence. It was still cold, still harsh, still vulnerable, but it endured. And because Moldavia endured, Europe was given something precious: time. The Battle of Vaslui was not just a victory carved into winter ice. It was a line drawn by a people who refused to vanish quietly. It was proof that empires, no matter how vast, were not immune to preparation, patience, and resolve. Stephen did not mistake attention for alliance. Praise, he knew, was easier to give than aid. Titles cost nothing. Declarations faded quickly. What mattered was time to rebuild, to prepare, to harden defences against the certainty that Vaslui would provoke response, not retreat. As winter began to loosen its grip, the valley slowly returned to itself. Snow melted. The river resumed its steady course. Yet the land was changed. Paths once ordinary now carried memory. Ground once unremarkable had been tested and found decisive. The physical landscape bore the imprint of human determination. Trees along ridges were scarred by arrows and cannon fire, their bark chipped and blackened. The riverbanks were churned, ice fractured in irregular patterns where men and horses had slipped or fallen. Even the snow that lingered in shaded hollows carried the faint, dark stain of the day's struggle. But these marks, grim though they were, also told a story of ingenuity and courage. They whispered that a small people, armed with knowledge of their land and unyielding resolve, could shape the earth into both fortress and weapon. Stephen understood this as he surveyed the scene. The valley had become more than battleground. It had become testament. Every ridge, every frozen ford, every hidden path would be remembered, not as terrain, but as proof that meticulous preparation and unwavering will could bend the course of events, even against the mightiest foe. The battle receded into history, but its consequences did not. The men of Moldavia lingered along the heights, the cold air biting through tattered cloaks, their breaths rising in clouds. Fires dotted the ridges, flickering orange against the stark white landscape. Some prayed silently, hands clasped over ribs still aching from exertion. Others simply sat, shoulders hunched, staring at the shadows cast by the rising moon across the valley. It was a quiet moment of reckoning, of understanding that what they had achieved was extraordinary, and yet would demand vigilance in the years to come. Stephen did not linger long with them. He walked the ridges slowly, each step measured, eyes tracing the valley that had tested them all. He thought not of fame, nor of gratitude, nor even of relief. He thought of the future. Every decision now carried the weight of survival, rebuilding defences, restoring morale, preparing for the inevitable vengeance that would come. And though the snow would eventually melt, and though the forests would reclaim the scars of battle, the lessons of Vaslui would endure, etched into the minds of men, into the memory of the land, into the story of a nation that refused to vanish quietly. Stephen the Great would fight many more battles. Some would be victories, others would be costly, but none would ever capture the same fragile, perfect convergence of land, weather, and human will as that January morning near Vaslui, where mist became armour, where ice became a weapon, and where a small nation stood firm, guarding the gate to a continent, not with promises of glory, but with the simple, unyielding decision to survive.